This video is hard for me, man. Listen, y'all know I love Jimmy Butler. I've said many times he's the definition of a superstar, and the Heat need to ride with him until the wheels fall off. Well, right now the wheels are certainly falling off for the Miami Heat. I mean, the vibes in that locker room must be terrible. Man, we can't even export this video without it getting worse. Of course, I check Twitter as this video is exporting, and I see that the Miami Heat have suspended Jimmy Butler again. This time 2 games for missing the team flight. So he won't be there when the Heat play Milwaukee tomorrow, if that game is played, because that team's currently stuck in a snowstorm in New Orleans, which is crazy. But Jimmy won't be there for that, and he won't be there for their next game versus Brooklyn. And after that, who knows if he's still on the team. But yeah, the Heat suspend Jimmy Butler again, and they will probably trade him very soon. But anyways, enjoy the video. They just got blown out 4 out of their last 5 home games, with the most recent one being yesterday to Joe Cronin's team. Oh, they got killed by the Portland Trailblazers, and it made me sick. So it's become more clear than ever that the Heat need to move on from Jimmy Butler immediately. But what's also become clear over the last couple of days is exactly what a framework would look like to get Jimmy Butler to the Phoenix Suns. Now, just because I say the framework is clear does not mean that it's easy. If it was easy, I'm sure it would have happened already. But in reality, there's a lot of complications involved with getting Jimmy Butler over to the Phoenix Suns. So in today's video, I want to discuss what those complications are and also go over what the framework will likely look like for a Jimmy Butler deal to Phoenix. Because at this point, I think we can say with near 100% certainty that's where Jimmy's going to end up, because I don't think any teams are willing to pay a 35-year-old aging star with injury concerns who's demanding a max extension outside of the crazy Suns owner, Matt Ishbia. And it's also no secret that the Suns have been gearing up for this trade. Just yesterday, they traded their very valuable 2031 first-round pick for an additional 3 first-round picks to basically give them some more assets to move money, aka Bradley Beal. And the reason they were able to do that is because that 2031 pick that the Suns have is going to be super valuable. I mean, Jimmy Butler's 35, Kevin Durant's 36, and 2031 is in 6 years from now. So both those guys are likely out of the league, and if they're not, they're in their 40s. And you got to imagine the Phoenix Suns are not going to be that good at that point. So that pick is likely to be very, very high in the draft. So because the Suns made that trade yesterday to get a couple of first-round picks to flip, that makes it a lot more likely for a 4 or 5 team trade to happen, which is almost certainly going to be the framework for a Jimmy Butler deal. So I want to shout out Sam Quinn, who admittedly in the past, I did not like some of his work, but I think this is a very good article that he dropped on CBS today, kind of explaining what that framework would look like. And in his article titled Jimmy Butler Mock Trades, Suns in position for blockbuster, but they'll need help from Bucks and others, he does detail what a lot of the complications are and then what a deal would look like. Now, the biggest issue here is that damn second apron, because teams that are above that threshold are heavily limited when making trades. The biggest limitation for second apron teams is they cannot aggregate players in a trade, meaning they cannot trade more than one player at a time, which makes this deal very hard because the Milwaukee Bucks and Phoenix Suns are both second apron teams. Now, the catch to that is as long as the trade makes you under the second apron, then you are allowed to do that. So basically meaning the Suns and the Bucks would at least have to send out enough money to be under the second apron during the trade in order for the trade to be officially finalized. But even that rule is a bit confusing because in the framework that I'm about to show you, the Bucks will be under the second apron after the trade, but the Suns will not be, but they'll still be aggregating some salaries. And the reason that's possible is, again, it's confusing, but this is how Sam Quinn puts it. He says the answer to that, without getting too into the weeds about cap minutia, is that trading multiple salaries does not always equal aggregation. The cap has mechanisms for simultaneous trades to account for situations like this. So basically, there's some rules, there's some stipulations. And as Sam goes on, he says, for now, all you need to know is that Beal makes more money than Butler. Therefore, a Beal for Butler straight up trade is legal without aggregation on Phoenix's end. Adding another salary on top of an already legal match does not negate the trade's legality so long as all other parties are able to complete the deal. Now, that might sound very confusing to you. It was to me the first time I read it, but I reread it about 100 times until I finally understand what he is saying, and some more research I had to do as well. But basically, this will be one singular 4-team trade, but how the CBA looks at it is one part of that trade is Jimmy for Beal another part of that trade, for example, could be Ryan Dunn for somebody else. So it's not like the Suns are aggregating players. They're doing one separate trade with Beal, another separate trade with Ryan Dunn or Jusuf Nurkic, and it's like they're doing two separate deals with one player and therefore not aggregating salaries. So hopefully that clears up a little bit of the confusion on why the Suns are able to aggregate assets, but the Bucks aren't. But in reality, if it doesn't make sense, it probably shouldn't, because the entire CBA makes no sense. And it's really stupid. And fortunately, the only person that truly understands it is Andy Ellisberg. And he's on our team, so I'm happy with that. And the final restriction here, before we even get into the framework, is that these teams will need to make some additional roster moves after the trade in order to meet the roster minimum and maximum restrictions. For example, Detroit might have to waive a player, or the Bucks might need to sign 2 players to get to the 14-player maximum. And even that is a little bit more difficult because, again, they are making this trade to be under the second apron. And if they just go out into free agency and sign anyone, it is difficult for them to also stay under the second apron. The Bucks would essentially need to plan out 10-day contracts to get guys on the roster without going over the apron, and then also find veterans whose prorated salary is also less than their difference to the second apron. But then the Bucks could only have less than 14 players for 2 consecutive weeks at a time, but no more than 28 days total in a season. That's right, I read up on my CBA before recording this video, and it's very confusing. So I'm sorry to give you all this jargon, but I guess the point is this trade is difficult, but let's get into the framework. So I'll technically be showing 3 mock trades this video, but really they all center around this framework, which is going to be the Pistons acquiring Pat Connaughton and MarJon Beauchamp, along with the 2029 first-round pick from Phoenix. The Heat would be getting Khris Middleton, Bobby Portis, and Ryan Dunn, as well as a 2027 first-round pick from the Phoenix Suns. And then the Bucks would be acquiring Bradley Beal in a 2025 first-round pick from the Suns. And then finally, the Suns will be getting, of course, Jimmy Butler. Now, these 3 first-round picks that you see here are the ones that the Suns just acquired yesterday. That's why a trade like this is now possible. And starting with a team like the Detroit Pistons, they're basically taking on Pat Connaughton's 2-year salary for a first-round pick. That's kind of their incentive there. They are getting that 2029 pick, so it's a little bit more in the future for a team that's sort of rebuilding, but also kind of wants to make the playoffs. They're in a bit of a weird spot, but I certainly think they're in a good place to take on that Connaughton salary and get that first-round pick. We'll get into the Heat last here because there's a lot going on there. But in this case, the Bucks will be getting Bradley Beal in a first-round pick. The first-round pick is just to incentivize the Bucks to take on his salary. But there's a few other trades where the Bucks might not actually need that first-round pick, depending on how much they value Bradley Beal. I'm sure they don't love his contract, but I do think the Bucks would like Beal as a third scoring option, especially since they would be losing Khris Middleton in this trade. Bradley Beal has been more healthy than Middleton over the last several seasons, so I could see the Bucks maybe going for something like this. And of course, the Suns get Jimmy Butler. That really doesn't need any explanation. I still don't think they're a contender or anything. I'm not even sure they get out of the first round. I guess it depends who their matchup is, but like the Suns are the 10th seed now. Why they're so desperate to get Jimmy Butler to still be middling or below average, I don't know, but whatever. So for the Miami Heat, we'll start with Khris Middleton, who I still think can be a productive player at this stage of his career when healthy. He's 33 years old, which isn't super old in today's NBA, but we'll take a look at his contract here first, in which he's making $31 million this year with a $34 million player option next season. I do think he's likely to opt into that player option just because he does have the injury concerns, and $34 million is a lot of money for a guy who'll be getting paid $34. But I do suppose if Khris was to come here and have a very good second half of the season, maybe he would opt out and potentially re-sign or sign elsewhere for a longer-term deal. And if you look at Khris Middleton's stats here, you can see he hasn't played over 68 games since 2019. That is a problem. He's only played 18 games this season, and although he has been playing recently, his numbers really aren't great, at least not in the calendar year. But on the season as a whole, he's been okay. 13 points per game. He's shooting 48% from the field and 37% from three. So he still is a relatively efficient player. But the main concern here is the injuries. I do think if he was able to stay healthy consistently, we would see his numbers and efficiency jump right back up to what we're used to. Now, I'm not saying he's the player he was a few years ago, certainly not defensively, but I do think he could be a productive player for the next half a season to season and a half for the Miami Heat, because just last playoffs in the first round, he actually was the only healthy one, which is ironic. It was Giannis and Dame who was hurt in the first round, where Middleton played all 6 games. And in those 6 games, he averaged 25 points per game, 9 rebounds, 5 assists, and shot 48% from the field. And that was literally just last playoffs. So about a year ago at this point. So he has shown that relatively recently he can still be a productive player in this league. Now, as far as Bobby Portis, I think he's a Heat culture guy. I think we can all agree on that. He's the type of player that you hate him if he's on the other team, but I think you would love him if he was on your team. This Heat team desperately needs a backup center, and Bobby Portis has been one of the best backup bigs in the entire league for quite a while now. He also has a team-friendly contract. He's only getting paid $12 million this year with a $13 million player option next season. That one, I do think he's more likely to opt out, unlike Khris Middleton, just because Bobby Portis will only be 30 years old, and I think he'll be looking to re-up for a long 4-year deal, either in Miami or somewhere else. But regardless, he would be a productive player here for the next half a year, 2 year and a half, just like Khris Middleton. And if you look at his numbers this season, they're still pretty decent, as they typically are. He's averaging 13 points per game with 8 boards, shooting 46% from the field and 37% from three. And as a guy that is 6'10", I think that would be very beneficial to the Miami Heat, because especially now that they're starting Khalil Ware and Bam Adebayo, which I love, our backup center is now who? Kevin Love. We could very clearly use a backup center, so this will be a good piece for the Heat right now. And then Ryan Dunn is an asset that should really excite Miami Heat fans. I mean, I didn't watch any of Virginia basketball, but I heard he was one of the best defenders coming out of college in a long time. So I went and looked up that boy's highlights. Man, I must have watched it for 30 seconds, and I was blown away. So if y'all haven't seen what Ryan Dunn does out there on the defensive end, do yourself a favor and go look it up. And then after you watch that, tell me that he's not a Heat culture guy, because I absolutely think he is. But his numbers so far in his rookie season for Phoenix have been pretty decent, averaging 8 points per game on 46% shooting from the field and 32% shooting from three. Although I do want to note that actually early on in the season, he was kind of off to a blazing start from three. He was a little bit above 42% before regressing back a little bit. But the reason that that's interesting is because coming out of college, Ryan Dunn was not known as a shooter, to put it not nicely. He was a terrible shooter, which is why he fell to the second round after being the best defender in the draft. But if Ryan Dunn is able to continue working on his shot and get relatively close to the 40% that we saw earlier this season, then he will be an amazing 3-and-D player in this league for a very long time. And maybe the Heat could bring some of that out of him, because truthfully, the shooting reminds me a little bit of Justice Winslow. And the Heat turned Winslow from a very poor 3-point shooter to a guy who was pretty reliable for a few seasons before all the weird injury stuff with him happened. But one difference there, though, is Justice Winslow was 19 when he came to the Heat. Ryan Dunn is already 22, but he just turned 22 a couple of weeks ago, so he's not like a player that's super old. He only went to Virginia for 2 years, so there still is plenty of room for him to improve in this league. So it is kind of important that the Heat are getting 3 pieces that could help them win now. Of course, when I say win now, I'm not talking about for a championship. I'm talking just to make the playoffs. But the reason that that's important is because there's a lot of restrictions on where their draft capital is out right now. And also in this trade, the fact the Heat are getting a 2027 first-round pick is also really important, because they currently don't have their own pick in that year. But Sam Quinn does a good job explaining their complicated draft asset history. Basically, Sam says the 2027 pick is uniquely valuable to them because if the Heat manage to make the playoffs this season, they will owe their 2027 first-round pick to the Hornets. That creates messy Stepien rule problems for future trades, but having a guaranteed 2027 round pick from another team could help them solve it. If the Heat didn't make the playoffs, that's where the bigger complications come in. And as Sam goes on to say, if the Heat miss the playoffs this year, they instead owe out an unprotected pick in 2026 to the Thunder and a 2028 unprotected pick to the Hornets. Therefore, it's a priority for the Heat to reach the playoffs this season, which is why they are getting a player-centric package back. So to try to explain this to the best of my ability, if the Heat make the playoffs this year, they would only be essentially losing 1 first-round pick, where if they miss the playoffs, they would essentially be losing 2 first-round picks. But I guess it just depends on preference of Heat fans. Would you rather have a pick in this draft, or would you rather have 2 future picks down the line? To me, it's a no-brainer. You want more picks because then you have more assets to go after a star trade. But I guess it just depends on how you feel as a Heat fan. But certainly the more picks, the better, because if you were to have Bobby Portis and Khris Middleton, they would be expiring contracts next season, and then you would be able to use those deals and whatever picks you have to go after a star if there's one available. And if there's not one available, well, the 2026 draft class is actually shaping up to be potentially promising. You could have guys like De'Aaron Fox or Trae Young or Luka Doncic. Now, I don't like to put too much stock into free agency because nowadays you see either most stars get extensions or get traded before they ever reach free agency. But either way, the Heat will have the money in 2026 or the assets before that to get a guy like Luka if he doesn't sign an extension, or De'Aaron Fox who still hasn't signed his extension. So the Heat will have some options there if they do this trade. So that's essentially what the framework for a deal to get Jimmy to Phoenix would look like. Sam does have a couple of more trades in this video, like this trade right here, which is essentially the same thing, except in this case, the Pistons would be getting Bobby Portis and no first-round picks. I guess the Pistons would use Portis as kind of a backup big to help them on their playoff push this season. And then you would also get the Raptors involved, who would be getting Pat Connaughton's salary with that 2029 first-round pick. The reason I wanted to bring this up is because we have heard a lot of rumblings that the Raptors want to get involved in this 4 or 5 team trade, just because they do have some salary cap space to take on contracts and some expiring contracts like Kelly Olynyk and Bruce Brown that they would be able to send out. And for the Heat here, they do get one benefit of not getting Bobby Portis, which is that they'd be able to remain under the salary cap in its entirety. Essentially, right now, the Heat are $13.5 million over, but by sending out Jimmy Butler and only taking back Khris Middleton and Ryan Dunn, they'd be about $1.5 million under the salary cap, which if you're Mickey Arison, I'm sure you love. If you're a Heat fan, you probably don't care. And this is the third trade that Sam Quinn put out, which again is basically the same, except this time Portland's involved, which means I don't want to talk about it at all. Because if Joe Cronin couldn't work with us before, what the hell makes you think he's going to work with us now? Plus, all this trade does is benefit the Suns even more because they also get Robert Williams. But yeah, I don't think this last one is very likely, although the framework is similar, so you guys get the idea. Now, the only other rumors we've really heard is like maybe the Bucks want to go after Zach LaVine as their third scoring punch, although I don't think the Bulls would want to trade LaVine in the division. But that's just another name to watch. But outside of all that, maybe the Heat go after a guy like Ingram. I think he could be available. I think a guy like Zion or Fox or more pipe dreams, at least right now. But for the most part, everything I discussed in this video will likely be what the final trade looks like. But anyways, my camera's about to die. I've been talking for 35 minutes. I have no idea how long this actual video is going to be. I've been stuttering my words, feeling like I've been sounding confusing. So I don't know. I hope y'all understand. And more importantly, I hope this deal gets done soon so we can all move on. But make sure y'all like the video and subscribe. I'm on the grind to hit 7K subs. Drop your comments down below. I will be reading every single one. And I'll see y'all in the next video. Peace out, y'all.
Look, pull up in your city trying to get that dead face. Do it on my own, I don't need no dead weight. Had to kill him off, yeah, I need a head space. You know this homegrown bitch don't offend me.